Well, welcome back, everyone. This is part two of my dear friend, Neira Jones, payment security expert and someone who has just been plugged into this area for so many years. And to have watched what you have learned over the years, it genuinely astounds me. And to see the number of kind of influences that you've had on the payment security landscape, I think is super well deserved. And I think one of the most important things is you listen to people and you learn and you just aggregate all this massive information as well as taking your own thoughts into this. So there's a couple of key things I'd like to explore you, Neira, right now. Cooperation we touched on earlier, but we went down a path on that. But let's bring that back, both internal and external. I think that's going to lead into regulation. I've got some questions about challenges as well for you, but let's go on to this now. So payment security, cyber element of it, cooperation. What's missing? What are you seeing out there that we in the industry are not doing well, both internally and externally?
So we briefly touched on the internal challenges, and Dan already said that only the most mature organization will actually have established cooperation between cyber and information security, fraud prevention, and risk management department. I have seen that happen, but they are generally large organizations. So there is a lack of cooperation because certainly the cyber and infosec guys will have the tools to help the fraud guys. You know, we talked about DMARC earlier on. There are many other things, such as identity and access management and all sorts of other solutions. So talking is good in general. So that can be resolved, but it only comes with the most mature organization when it comes to risk management. Now, I did also mention earlier on that it is very different across sectors. We're talking about payments, so financial services in particular. In financial services, we're very precious about data. We very rarely share data. We very rarely share threat intelligence data. Now, we do know that there are many industry fraud databases coming from vendors that span across the world where you can get threat intelligence information, and Dan, I'm sure you provide these services yourself. So, but sharing that threat intelligence when it happens to you as a financial services organization, we don't often share because sometimes we don't even want to let other people know that we're facing this threat, whereas sharing is good because it's not competitive. Now, so I mentioned fraud databases when it comes to threat intelligence. There are also national initiatives. One such, for example, is the CISP in the UK, which Financial Services Organization can participate into. So sharing threat intelligence, we should definitely do more of that. So, and I think it would be for the better of the ecosystem or the various payments and financial services ecosystems as a whole. We're not there yet. And we need to do so much more of that. And of course, aside of that, communications is absolutely crucial. And we don't communicate enough, not only within our organizations to educate people to in relation to threats such as phishing, which we were mentioning earlier on, but also sort of other scams and how they happen and how to have good hygiene, not only corporate hygiene, but personal hygiene as well. When it comes to, don't click on that link side of thing, which I can't believe I'm still saying in 2023. But nevertheless, it happens, and it happens all the time. And you'd be surprised, Dan, to see that one section of demographics that is actually surprisingly for me anyway, when I looked at the latest stats, the younger demographics are very prone to social engineering, and you would think they are tech savvy. So it's not only the older generations now that are victims of these particular scams. And we have cooperation and still talking about internally and touching on regulations briefly, which is if you're a financial services institution or a payments institution in particular, you are burdened by a plethora of regulations, loads. The payments industry is heavily regulated. The financial services industry is heavily regulated. So that's law and statute. But not only that, we also have standards. So we also have standards such as, for example, the PCI DSS, which, okay, it's not law, it's not regulation, but it's part of card scheme operating rules. So if you're in payments, it's as good as. So we've got all of these. We've got the EMV standards, we've got the whatever standard, we've got to deploy 3D secure and so on and so forth to become more secure. So we've got all of that. So we've got anti-money laundering, payment services regulations, we've got the general data protection regulation and various other data privacy and data protection regulation. We've got the PCI DSS, we've got the EMV standards. So in that context, you won't be surprised, Dan, to hear that there is so much overlap between all of these regulations, but also these regulations traditionally within the realm of financial services, which only deal with financial services type things, now all include information security and cybersecurity requirements. Take the Second Payment Services Directive. Massive articles that deal with data protection, incident response, information security best practice. Same for anti-money laundering regulation. So in an organization, you will have people that deal with PSD2 compliance. You will have people that deal with money laundering, generally in the risk department. Then you would have the people that deal with the general data protection regulation, which sometimes even sit with the information security guys, and so on and so forth. Then you've got the PCI DSS, which we know well, sitting with some other departments. And then when you realize stuff, simple stuff such as everybody that listens to this edition will, of course, know that the PCI DSS mandates that sensitive authentication data cannot be stored post-authorization. So everybody knows this. If you look at the specific requirement of the requirement of the DSS, it says you can't store sensitive authentication data, full content of the magnetic stripe, pin block, you can't store that. For card data per se, the primary account number, as you know, if stored, because that's allowed, must be rendered unreadable as per the standard. So you encrypt, you tokenize, you truncate, whatever it is that you do with it. And then you have the name. So the name, the PCI DSS says, store it by all means. The PCI DSS doesn't say render it unreadable. It says basically you can store it, and I don't really care because all I care about is the primary account number, the CVV, the service code, the what's on the MAC strap, and so on and so forth. Now, think about it for a second, and I call this data conjunction. Think about it for a second. If you look at the general data protection regulation, so in the general data protection regulation, it is supposed to protect individuals, protect the data of individuals, and I paraphrase, not just the GDPR, but all data privacy law worldwide. It basically says your name is personal information. So your name, whilst in itself may not be able to allow for identification of you, but your name in conjunction with something else, such as a primary account number, a postcode, a job title, a town, I may very well be able to identify you with a few elements. The PCI DSS doesn't care about the name. The GDPR says it's personal information used in conjunction with other elements. Now, and you look at all the other regulations, pretty much the same. You have security requirements on data retention and so on and so forth. So it is therefore staggering when we go back to cooperation, when it comes to regulations, that in an organization, you have one team that deals with PSD or payment services regulation, whatever they may be. And then they say, okay, we need to meet these regulatory obligations. Yep. And therefore we need to deploy technology in order to comply with the regulatory obligation. These guys don't talk to the AML guys. The AML guys, they say we need to meet these regulatory obligation. We need to do whatever it is when we do KYC and so on and so forth. And therefore, we'll ask the IT guys so that we can deploy the technology to enable us to do that. You do that. And then you've got the GDPR guys say encryption and so on and so forth, and data security, and they do that. And you end up spending money here, money there, somewhere else for the PCI DSS for the same thing.
Not joined up.
And my advice, it's incredible. And my advice always is to organization, by all means, I get it. I get it where you have a team that deals with PSD because they need to be payment specialists. I get it where you need to have an AML team because they are risk specialists. I get it where you have a data protection team dealing with all of that. But at the end of the day, look at it in a holistic fashion with an umbrella over all of those to essentially say, I'm going to do this and I put that over because that technology that you want to deploy will actually hit several birds with one stone.
It will indeed. And there is no cooperation around that. And that's one of the things we see so much, and I hear so much from CISOs, people responsible for various aspects of various regulations you've just mentioned. They are struggling because they're still having problems because the overlap is not like a Venn diagram. It doesn't fully cover the center bit. And so you get gaps, deficiencies, too much monitoring, not enough sight within that monitoring. Interesting. Now, in another interesting one, and fun enough, we're going to do another talk on it, and next week I've booked it in, which is nice. A mutual CISO friend of ours that we were discussing just before this call, he was saying something very, very interesting, which is around this area as well. I'll explore it with him, which is people don't share. So we've all been led down this thought that, there's a lot of sharing, and there is. You and I have sat at the banking forums together before, all those kind of things. But he made a very good point about CISO strategy in relation to all of these point solutions. These sit under, ultimately, the CISO, and the CISO's got to get this visibility. But the CISO talks to, as quote, talk to your best CISO buds out there about what they're doing, but they tend to be questions about point solutions. What they don't do is say, here's my CISO strategy, could you please have a look at it? That's private, so the sharing doesn't happen. And other comments I've heard in the last 6 months are, yes, but we're too busy now because there's more and more load on people because of all these PCI, GDPR, Californian stuff, blah. It's just so much that they can't talk to each other. And the thing I now hear is, see you at the next Gartner. And so there's not that collaboration. What are your thoughts, Neira? You speak with these people all the time as well. What are you seeing?
I speak with, and I'm seeing exactly the same thing. You share information about report that's been published, information about a particular solution, thinking about these ones. Have any of you guys deployed it? And they say, oh yes, we have, or we use that, or whatever. So there is sharing in respect with advice on whatever the particular issue, but there is no sharing in the sense that we were mentioning earlier on, says threat intelligence sharing, what's coming on the horizon, have you observed this, what are you doing with
what are you
it,
anticipating?
Are you anticipating indeed? And that, I'm afraid, Dan, going back to regulations, can only be promoted or encouraged or incentivized, so to speak, if regulators actually step in.
But this is interesting, isn't it? Because it brings up yet another point, which is there are so many behaviors here are very point solution driven. Is it because a compliance cycle mandates a certain set of things, and then to get that sort of problem off your back, you deploy that point solution, and therefore it's stopping people, the regulation itself, because it's in a certain realm, is not allowing for that holistic view of cybersecurity because you're trying to get compliance. So we're basically becoming servants to compliance now.
Totally. And the spend, there was a really good article on International Banker a few months back, essentially saying that we're actually getting, really good stats in there saying we're getting better at protecting ourselves, undeniably, because we've learned a lot, we've deployed more technology, and therefore we should become more operationally efficient. But why is it then that we're spending so much more money? And that's exactly because of that, because we don't look at it in a holistic fashion, overall and across the board. Maybe it will happen in time, because, and when I was saying earlier on, that sort of cooperation can only happen if the regulators push in and actually make it a requirement. And you see, when a regulator does that, such as in the UK, saying, we now, directed entities, whatever they may be, you're going to send us data every month on such and such, whatever may be the issue. And you can see the directed entities, generally banks or other financial services institutions, will push back because it is a burden. But once you start getting the data in, which undeniably is a burden, but once the regulator starts getting the data in, they would be able to say, look, this is what the picture is. And therefore, these are what the problems are. And therefore, this is what we need to address as a regulator. But without visibility and transparency on what is actually happening, well, how can you regulate something you can't measure?
Can't measure because you can't see. But there's another thing as well that I observed, and it was in financial services about a year ago, where it was a total blind spot because that organization was so focused on the things that they had to do, and they had corporate activity going on as well. They were, under financial regulation, and there was a massive blind spot that was obvious to see. And I was actually in that board meeting and talking about general risk and just advising the board on this one. Something I'm finding more and more cybersecurity firms have been brought in to advise the board or just to give an opinion and try and help shape that. And the answer was, yeah, we get it, it's important, but we've got our regulation to focus on. And you're thinking, but that use case that we were exploring here could destroy all of the above and take it all away. But no, it wasn't given any form of attention because that's not what the regulation needed. And that's scary.
Yeah.
Seriously
and that is
scary.
very scary. And I tell you what else is scary, Dan, is in financial services especially, comply with the regulation will always be left to the last minute.
Is that human nature?
And I give you an example. It's human nature. I give you an example. In the UK, we've got something called the Consumer Duty Bill. So it came into force earlier on in the summer.
Okay.
And basically, the Consumer Duty Bill says financial services organization must ensure good outcomes for consumers. So basically, treating them fairly, making sure they're not penalized, and things like writing things in plain English, so they are not obscure when you have terms and conditions or policies and so on and so forth. So this happened earlier on this summer. So you kindly mentioned my book earlier on. So I wanted to write a book to democratize payments knowledge. So there is an organization in the UK which awards you this thing called the Crystal Mark. So, and I wanted to put my book through the Crystal Mark. This was round about August. So, and the regulation was due, the deadline was due to come into force at some point. So I contact the organization because they award Crystal Mark for books. And I say, okay, this is my book. It's so many words, blah, blah, blah. And they reply to me and they say, sorry, we can't help you until next year. This is because the regulation is due to come into force, and we're so busy with financial services organization looking at their policies and their guidelines and so on and so forth, that we have absolutely no bandwidth to look at your book. I mean, converting something, a document, into plain English is kind of no great chase, is it? So you do it. Bearing in mind that the Consumer Duty Bill has been around, people knew that it was going to happen since 2021. So why did you wait until a few months ago to actually comply with the damn thing? So there you are. So we always wait until the last minute to do something. And I bet you Dan, similarly to DMARC we were talking earlier on, best practice in PCI DSS
yes,
until
absolutely.
2025 or whatever. When will it happen?
2025. 2 months before.
There you are.
And every auditor then will be busy verifying that component of it.
Totally.
It's human nature, isn't it? But it's human nature possibly driven by so many factors, because there is only so much a cyber / payments / CISO / whatever function around these disciplines can physically take on. And one thing I've heard so much of late, which is fascinating, which is my organization, and it doesn't matter if it's a $500 million, billion, multiple billion revenue, only has so much budget. However, and therefore only so many cycles of resources it can deploy on these topics, and therefore it becomes a business and risk decision. But cyber criminals have unlimited time, unlimited resources. And so it's almost, one has to play to all the rules, and the other one with lots and lots of constraints and lots of time constraints.
Totally. And then the law is only ever for the lawful. So going back to cooperation, we're so bad at it, as in on the good side of the fence. Criminals cooperate. Organized crime and we cooperate with each other, and they're not constrained by regulation. They can move very fast. So maybe we should learn from cyber criminals.
Well, isn't that interesting? You only get a speeding ticket if you have a licensed vehicle and you have a registration and are compliant to the law, and then break that particular law and the law is for the lawful. I've not heard that ever said before. How interesting. Neira, let's sum up. In your mind, let's look forward to the next year. We're coming up to 2025. We're in nearly December now. Can't believe it's nearly Christmas. But what do you anticipate and foresee will be the top themes that people will have to contend with in this coming cycle?
Oh, certainly worldwide and undeniably, in the payment space, it will continue to be payment fraud in whichever way, because criminals will always follow the money. So payment fraud, be it card not present fraud, be it authorized push payment fraud, because there will be such a big increase for bank payments worldwide as they deploy more and more real-time payments infrastructure. So that will continue on the upwards trajectory. Artificial intelligence will play a big role both in fighting it, but also in helping it. Yeah, so certainly keep up to date, because it's not going to stop. And be smart. Essentially, look at where you spend the money and don't go and spend it in several places where you're actually addressing the same problem.
And giving yourself more and more things, then watch with more solutions, more point solutions. This is the thing that keeps coming up. Neira, as always, wonderful to collaborate, speak with you. I always enjoy our chats. Thank you very much indeed.
Dan, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to the next time.
Ditto. Thanks, Neira.